It was not the ice that doomed her. It was the hubris, the blinding, glittering conviction that man had finally mastered the sea. For 6 days, the Titanic sailed not merely across the North Atlantic, but through a fever dream of Edwardian excess, carrying a manifest of the world's most extravagant wealth and its most desperate hopes. She was a steel fortress, a floating palace designed to defy the very elements. Yet, on the blackest night of April 1912, the laws of physics, not human invention, would cast the final, unsparing judgment. The air in Southampton on Wednesday, April 10, 1912, was electric, thick with the smell of coal smoke and new paint. The RMS Titanic, 882 feet and 9 inches long, longer than any ship that had ever floated, dominated the skyline. Her 4 massive funnels, painted the rich buff yellow of the White Star Line, angled slightly back, conveying a sense of irresistible speed even while docked. She was the most potent symbol of the machine age, a promise of safe, luxurious, and swift passage between the old world and the new. For the passengers arriving at the White Star Line's new ocean dock, the sheer scale was astonishing. The gentry, the industrialists, and the titans of finance stepped from motor cars and taxis, their silk coats and furs brushing against the throngs of well-wishers and curious onlookers. This was not just a voyage, it was a societal event, a floating exhibition of power and prestige. The golden ticket holders, first class. The passengers of the A deck and B deck were a roster of American and British royalty, not of title, but of money. They were the architects of the modern world. There was Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, heir to one of the world's great fortunes, accompanied by his controversial, pregnant 18-year-old wife, Madeline. He was known for his icy reserve and his immense real estate holdings in New York. The colonel, impeccably dressed, showed little emotion, but his presence alone conferred status upon the entire voyage. He brought his Airedale, Kitty, a symbol of the comfort he expected. Walking the polished parquet floors nearby was Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate. Flamboyant and debonair, he was traveling with his French mistress, Leontine Aubart, and his valet, Victor Giglio. Guggenheim carried an air of reckless confidence, viewing the trip as a brief, gilded interlude before returning to his business empire. Perhaps the most astonishing woman on board was Margaret Molly Brown of Denver, a social whirlwind with a newly acquired fortune from a gold strike. She was loud, boisterous, and entirely unfazed by the staid British society she now mingled with. She wore her wealth conspicuously and possessed a common-sense bravery that few of her refined companions could match. She was heading to New York to visit her daughter. Overseeing the whole majestic undertaking was J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line. He saw the Titanic not just as a ship, but as the crowning achievement of his career, a vessel that would cement his company's dominance. His presence was a constant reminder of the ship's importance. He was a businessman first and a sailor never, and that distinction would become tragically important. The interior, the illusion of land. Once inside, the illusion of being at sea vanished completely. The Titanic's first class was a deliberate architectural deception. The grand staircase, a breathtaking cascade of polished oak, wrought iron, and glass, rose 7 decks high, capped by an elaborate glass dome. Electric light, a novelty for many, poured down illuminating carvings of cherubs and classical allegories. Passengers dined in a dining saloon that spanned the entire width of the ship, finished in gleaming white paneling and large windows, feeling more like a lavish London hotel than a liner. For those seeking more privacy, the à la carte restaurant offered a level of culinary and decorative sophistication, Louis XVI style, with velvet-backed chairs and crystal chandeliers that was unparalleled. They boasted a kitchen that could produce a 10-course dinner for 500 people simultaneously. The message was clear. There were no privations at sea for those with means. Below the gilded cage, second and third class. Down in the bowels of the great ship, a far different reality existed. Second class, occupied by clerks, teachers, professionals, and retired military personnel, was still superior to first class on most other ships. They had their own library, smoking room, and a respectable dining room. But it was third class, or steerage, that held the most poignant passenger manifest. Jammed near the loud, rumbling engines, often forward to a small wood-paneled cabin, were the hopeful immigrants, Irish farmers fleeing poverty, Scandinavian laborers seeking new opportunities, and Lebanese families escaping political unrest. They had paid between $35 and $40, a significant fraction of a year's wages for their passage. They carried their entire lives in trunks, their eyes fixed firmly on the promise of the American dream. They spoke a babel of tongues, but shared a single destination, New York City. They would spend their days on the forward well deck, watching the vast, indifferent ocean slip by, debating whether to open a store in Minnesota or take a factory job in Pittsburgh. The stark class differences were enforced by invisible lines and locked gates. Third-class passengers were strictly barred from the areas reserved for first and second class. This was not merely about amenities, it was about maintaining the rigid social order of 1912, even 2,000 miles from shore. The engine room, the heart of the beast. Far beneath the velvet and crystal, the true force of the Titanic labored. This was a separate universe, a hot, dark, and deafening inferno. Over 300 Black Gang firemen and trimmers toiled in the boiler rooms, shoveling up to 600 tons of coal a day into 29 immense boilers. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with coal dust. They were the anonymous muscle that gave the millionaire's yacht its magnificent 21-knot speed. Their world was fire and steel, a violent contrast to the delicate canapes served 5 decks above. Their fate, though they could not know it, was irrevocably linked to the captains of industry, enjoying the ship's luxury.
The departure. At noon on April 10, the Titanic began her powerful, shuddering departure from the dock. The ropes were cast off, the great triple-screw propellers churned, and a low, resonant blast from her whistle echoed across the harbor. As she moved slowly past the docked liners, a disastrous near-miss occurred. The suction created by the Titanic's immense size pulled the smaller, moored liner, New York, so violently that its mooring lines snapped with pistol-shot cracks. Only a quick response from Captain Edward J. Smith and the ship's tugs prevented a collision. It was an ominous, if quickly dismissed, warning. The power of this ship was nearly uncontrollable, capable of creating its own danger. After a brief stop at Cherbourg, France, to pick up wealthy continental passengers, and a final stop at Queenstown, now Cobh, Ireland, to take on the final group of steerage passengers and mail, the Titanic turned her bow westward. On the afternoon of Thursday, April 11, 1912, she entered the open Atlantic. The sun shone, the sea was calm, and the ship, vibrating with the power of her engines, settled into the rhythm of her destiny. Captain Smith, a 40-year veteran of the White Star Line, a man affectionately known as the Millionaire's Captain, felt a quiet confidence. He was scheduled for retirement after this voyage. What could possibly go wrong on this, the ultimate modern vessel? He commanded a world of steel, electricity, and engineering perfection. A delusion of safety. The ship had been built and marketed with a single potent word: unsinkable. The basis of this boast lay in her sophisticated internal structure, a double bottom and 16 massive separate watertight compartments, each sealed with hydraulically operated doors. The engineers claimed that even if 4 of these 16 compartments were breached and flooded, the ship could still stay afloat. This confidence, however, bred complacency. It was the reason why, when the first ice warnings from other vessels began to filter into the wireless room on Sunday, April 14th, they were not treated with the urgency they demanded. At 7:30 p.m. on Sunday, the powerful American liner Baltic sent a warning: have had moderate variable winds and fine, clear weather since leaving. Icebergs and field ice in latitude 41 degrees 51 minutes north, longitude 49 degrees 52 minutes west. The message was delivered to Captain Smith as he enjoyed a dinner party in the first-class restaurant. He acknowledged it, showed it to Ismay, and then, inexcusably, it was posted in the chart room, but treated as routine. The ship did not slow. The pursuit of the blue ribbon, the prize for the fastest crossing, though officially denied, was an invisible pressure on the officers. The Titanic, the masterpiece of human ingenuity, was sailing full steam ahead into the heart of a massive, anomalous ice field. The Gilded Age was about to collide with the uncompromising power of nature. Chapter 2. The Hour of Ice. The transition from the day's careless luxury to the night's unforgiving silence was stark. Sunday, April 14, 1912. The air grew perceptibly colder as the Titanic sliced through the dark, placid water. The sea was exceptionally calm, like glass, as several passengers later recalled. This was deceptively dangerous. Without waves, there were no white breakers at the base of icebergs to betray their presence. Inside the first-class lounge, the air was warm with cigar smoke and the scent of champagne. Card games were underway. Colonel Astor was reading. Molly Brown was laughing loudly in the smoking room. Life was a comfortable, predictable cycle of dining, leisure, and society. The only reminder of the Atlantic outside was the gentle thrum of the immense engines below. The fatal oversight. The fatal oversight. On the bridge, the night was dangerously clear and moonless. The calm visibility meant the lookouts, Fleet and Lee, were relying entirely on spotting a silhouette against the stars, a near impossible task. Tragically, the ship was sailing with a crucial flaw. The binoculars for the lookouts were missing. They had been misplaced in Southampton, locked away in a locker whose key was accidentally parried off by the second officer, David Blair, who was transferred off the ship before she left. Fleet and Lee were effectively forced to rely on naked eye sighting in a field notoriously thick with ice. At 9:40 p.m., another ice warning crackled over the Marconi wireless set from the Mesaba, reporting much field ice and a great number of large icebergs. This vitally specific and urgent message never reached the bridge. Senior wireless operator Jack Phillips and his junior, Harold Bride, were overwhelmed. They were battling technical difficulties and sending a backlog of commercial passenger telegrams to Cape Race, Newfoundland, to be forwarded to New York, a service deemed more important than relaying routine hazard reports. The ship's speed remained a reckless 22.5 knots. At 10:30 p.m., the last passenger lights went out in the grand staircase dome. The ship was quieting down, preparing for the final 2 days of the journey.
The Californian and the silence of the sea. Meanwhile, just 10 to 20 miles away, the Leyland Line steamer Californian had stopped.
Captain Stanley Lord, a cautious and experienced mariner, knew his ship was surrounded by large pack ice. He calculated the danger and ordered his vessel to halt for the night. At 11 p.m., the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, attempted to warn the Titanic. "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." The response from the Titanic's overwhelmed Jack Phillips was impatient and chillingly dismissive. Shut up, I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Evans, deciding he had done his duty, switched off his wireless set and went to bed. The only ship close enough to render immediate aid was now deaf and blind. 11:40 p.m. The Shadow. In the cold, dark crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee scanned the horizon. The engine vibrations hummed through the steel structure. Suddenly, dead ahead, a massive, dark shape materialized, a shadow against the field of stars. It was not white, it was black, a reflection of the water below the ice. Fleet frantically rang the brass warning bell 3 times, the signal for danger immediately ahead, and grabbed the telephone. "Iceberg right ahead!" he shouted to 6th Officer Moody on the bridge. The news shot through the ship's command structure with paralyzing speed. First Officer Murdoch, a highly skilled officer who was on watch, leapt into action. He instantly ordered, "Hard a starboard! Turn the wheel fully to the left, attempting to swing the bow away from the object. Stop the engines. Full speed astern! Reverse the propeller rotation." It was too late. The sheer mass and momentum of the 46,000-ton liner made a quick turn impossible. The turning radius of the Titanic required a full half-mile. Only 37 seconds passed between the sighting and the collision, not enough time to affect the ship's course significantly. The bow began to swing to port, but the massive, submerged shoulder of the iceberg, the main body of the ice, met the ship's hull. Instead of a catastrophic head-on impact that might have crumpled the first 2 compartments, the Titanic suffered a glancing blow that resulted in a mile-long series of 6 small, vertical gashes in her starboard hull plates below the waterline across the first 5 watertight compartments. The sensation of impact. For the majority of passengers, the collision was anticlimactic. In the first-class dining room, it felt like a heavy tremor, or the ship scraping over an anchor chain. Some cups rattled. One woman described it as the sound of tearing calico. Many assumed it was merely a bump or a minor engine adjustment. In third class, further forward and closer to the impact, the sound was louder, a dull, drawn-out grinding roar. Water began to slosh into the lower baggage and postal sorting rooms almost immediately. Colonel Astor, sitting in his suite, felt a slight peculiar jar. He stepped onto the deck, saw no immediate cause, and famously told a fellow passenger, "I asked one of the officers what the trouble was, and he replied, 'A little ice.' I told him, 'I thought that was a rather large quantity of ice.'" The fatal diagnosis. Captain Smith arrived instantly on the bridge. He ordered the engines stopped and sent 4th Officer Boxhall to inspect the bow. Simultaneously, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, the man who knew every rivet of the vessel, was summoned from his cabin. Andrews immediately descended with Smith and his officers for a grim, hurried inspection tour. The inspection confirmed the worst. Water was rushing into the first 5 watertight compartments. The ship was designed to float with 4 compartments flooded, but 5 was a death sentence. Andrews, pale but stoic, performed the calculations quickly in his head, factoring in the weight of the water, the time until the bulkheads were breached, and the ship's forward rake. He delivered the news to Captain Smith. An hour, perhaps an hour and a half at most. The unsinkable ship was terminally wounded. She had less than 90 minutes of life remaining. The first orders. At 12:05 p.m., Captain Smith gave the agonizing order to prepare the lifeboats. He knew the shocking truth, but the lifeboats themselves represented another almost unbelievable failure. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for 1,178 people, less than half of the 2,208 souls aboard. Ismay, still maintaining a facade of control, found the order bewildering. "Why are the boats being put out?" he asked Smith, incredulous. Smith, his voice hollow, simply pointed to the rushing sea. The reality was setting in. The rules of the sea dictated that the most modern ship in the world was doomed, and the majority of her passengers were going to die because of a massive flaw in safety regulation and design confidence. The ship's crew began the difficult, impossible task of awakening passengers, convincing them of the danger, and directing them to the cold, open boat deck.
Chapter 3. The Terrible Protocol of Women and Children First. The hour between 12:15 a.m. and 1:15 a.m. was defined by a terrifying incongruity. Above, the sounds of music and denial. Below, the ceaseless sucking roar of the Atlantic, flooding the ship. The illusion of calm. Captain Smith, paralyzed by the enormity of the disaster, failed to give a decisive, clear order to his officers. The message relayed to first-class passengers was often minimized, a minor accident, or just a precaution against the chill. This was done to prevent panic, but it led to fatal hesitation. On the boat deck, the stewards struggled to persuade passengers to dress warmly and put on the cumbersome cork life belts. Many wealthy passengers, accustomed to unquestioning service, refused to believe their comfortable haven was sinking. They treated the whole affair as an irritating inconvenience. In the first-class smoking room, some men actually returned to their poker game, scoffing at the notion of danger. John Jacob Astor IV famously cut open a spare life belt to show his wife the useless cork inside, trying to maintain his calm, controlled facade. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, began playing lively ragtime tunes near the entrance to the grand staircase, a noble yet unsettling soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. The Lifeboat Protocol. Disorder and segregation. The lifeboats were lowered according to the ancient chivalric rule, women and children first. However, this noble ideal was immediately undermined by confusion, inexperience, and the brutal reality of class distinction. The first boats lowered were grossly underfilled, a monumental, costly mistake. Second Officer Lightoller, commanding the port side, interpreted the Women and Children First order as women and children only, refusing to allow single men, even if the boat had empty seats, to board. Lifeboat number 7, the first to launch at 12:45 a.m., designed to hold 65 people, left with only 28, mostly affluent American socialites. They were launched over 70 feet down to the sea, a terrifying descent that frightened passengers and crew alike. Lifeboat number 1, a small emergency cutter, left with a mere 12 people aboard, including the wealthy Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, leaving over 40 seats empty. This act would later lead to accusations that the occupants bribed the crew to row away quickly and not risk turning back. The American Grit. In the midst of the elegant confusion, the American spirit of practical action shone through. Molly Brown, refusing to be a passive victim, worked tirelessly, helping women into the boats and even bringing blankets from her own stateroom. When she was eventually forced by an officer into lifeboat number 6, she immediately took charge of the vessel, arguing with the lone timid crewman, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, to row back for survivors, a plea he angrily refused, citing the danger of being swamped by desperate swimmers. Molly's famous rallying cry was,
If we are going to die, we might as well die game. Colonel John Jacob Astor 4 ensured his young wife Madeline was safe in Lifeboat 4. He asked Second Officer Leidoler if he could join her, noting her condition. When Leidoler refused, Astor stepped back, nodded, and walked over to the starboard side. He was last seen calmly standing by the kennel runs, perhaps thinking of his Airedale kitty, or perhaps just accepting his fate with aristocratic stoicism. He exemplified the laissez-faire acceptance of the code by the elite men of the age. The forgotten third class. While the drama of the first class played out on the boat deck, the situation for the third-class passengers in the distant stern was exponentially worse. They were initially held behind the internal gates and barriers that enforced class segregation. These gates were not malicious, but were designed by U.S. immigration laws to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. However, on this night, they became death traps. The crew, following procedure, failed to immediately unlock and guide these passengers up through the maze of passageways. Around 1 a.m., as the slope of the deck grew noticeably steeper, some third-class men broke through the gates, scrambling desperately to reach the upper decks. Many, however, remained trapped in the lower decks and passageways as the water, cold and dark, inexorably rose. Thomas Andrews, the designer, was seen everywhere. He did not launch a boat. Instead, he wandered the corridors, pleading with passengers, "Put on your life belts. You have a better chance outside than in." He performed his final duty, calmly ensuring others were saved, even as his masterpiece of engineering failed beneath his feet. The wireless plea. Down in the Marconi shack, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked relentlessly. They no longer sent passenger messages. Their communications were now the global plea for life. At 12:45 a.m., the first distress signal, CQD, went out. Phillips urged Bride to use the new distress call, switched to the now universal SOS. The world's first successful use of the SOS signal was carried out by the sinking Titanic. The nearest responding ship was the Cunard Line's Carpathia, Captain Arthur Rostron commanding. Rostron received the faint, panicked signals and instantly ordered his vessel to turn around and race towards the Titanic's position, 58 miles away. The Carpathia pushed its engines past their limits, a heroic act that would take over 3 hours. But the silence from the nearby Californian was deafening. Captain Lord and his officers saw the rockets fired by the Titanic, but dismissed them as company signals or fancy rockets, never waking the wireless operator. The proximity of salvation and the failure to act on it remains one of the bitterest facts of the tragedy. The bow of the Titanic was now deep in the water, and the slant of the decks was unmistakable. Denial was replaced by dawning terror. The last lifeboats were being filled as the water crept up the magnificent grand staircase. The music was still playing, but the notes were now muffled by the terrible, rushing sounds of the ocean claiming its prize.
Chapter 4. The Final Plunge. By 1:40 a.m., the crisis was no longer about evacuation, it was about survival. The water had breached the forward bulkheads, engulfing the gymnasium and creeping onto the sea deck. The angle of the deck was now so steep that standing required effort. The atmosphere on the boat deck fractured into panic and desperation. The final boats were leaving, some now filled to capacity, others still short on numbers, but all were rowing away from the massive sinking ship. The last boats and the desperation. The crew desperately tried to launch collapsible lifeboats A and B, small, canvas-sided boats stored on the roof of the officers' quarters. Lifeboat number 4, the Titanic's second-to-last launched boat, swung precariously. Madeline Astor was safely aboard, her husband having stepped back into the shadows. This boat was one of the few that lowered near the water level and managed to rescue several swimmers later. Lifeboat number 15 and number 13 were lowered almost simultaneously.
They narrowly avoided disaster when the forward motion of the ship's propellers, still turning slowly as the engineers abandoned their post, pushed out a massive wash of water that nearly swamped them. A quick-thinking officer cut the falls, ropes, letting them drop free just in time. As the angle increased, the noise changed from the rush of water to the terrifying metallic groan of the ship's massive structure buckling under the strain. This was the sound of over 46,000 tons of steel protesting its destiny. 1:50 a.m. Thomas Andrews' final act. Thomas Andrews was last seen in the first-class smoking room, standing alone by the fireplace, staring at the painting, The Port of Plymouth. He had fulfilled his duty, guiding countless others to safety, but refusing to save himself. When a steward urged him to put on a lifebelt, Andrews simply shook his head. "I've done all I can." He chose to die with the ship that was the culmination of his life's work. 2:05 a.m. The last goodbyes. The main waterline had now reached the base of the grand staircase, rushing up the oak treads that only hours before were graced by glittering society. On the stern, near the railings, Captain Smith delivered his final whispered order to the remaining crew: every man for himself. The band, Wallace Hartley and his musicians, maintained their composure until nearly the last moment. They had moved from ragtime to hymns. Their final, heartbreaking number, widely believed to be the Episcopalian hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." The music provided a final thin veneer of human dignity against the roar of the sea, a supreme act of emotional courage witnessed by the horrified survivors. 2:18 a.m. The breakup. The strain on the hull was now too immense. The pressure where the water-filled bow met the still floating stern was unbearable. The lights, which had burned steadily for hours, flickered once, and then, with an audible pop, went out forever, plunging the ship and the surrounding sea into absolute, horrifying blackness. In that silence, the great ship began to break apart. Eyewitness accounts suggest a deafening series of cracking sounds, and then a tearing, agonizing snap. The Titanic fractured between the second and third funnels. The massive bow section, weighing perhaps 25,000 tons, plunged vertically, pulling the stern section upright. The stern rose, towering high against the black sky, its three giant propellers exposed. Furniture, pianos, and debris crashed down the decks. The remaining 1,500 people still aboard, clinging to the rails and the decks, were flung into the freezing water or tumbled down the rapidly sinking structure. 2:20 a.m. The plunge. The stern section hung vertical for perhaps 2 agonizing minutes, a black silhouette against the stars, before it too surrendered to gravity. It slid rapidly under the surface, spiraling and rushing as it went. 1.5 miles above the sea floor, the pressurized water tore the stern apart completely. The surface of the sea was now covered with a slick of oil and debris, and a chilling, ghastly sound, the collective, agonizing cry of 1,500 people suddenly immersed in the 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius water. It was, survivors recalled, a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. A sound that cut through the night, a high-pitched, desperate wail of human suffering that lasted for perhaps 10 minutes.
Chapter 5. The Silent Sea and the Price of Hubris. The lifeboats, scattered on the calm Black Sea, lay witness to the horror. Many boats, remembering the officers' fears of being swamped, refused to turn back into the maelstrom of screaming, struggling bodies. They sat motionless, their occupants listening in frozen dread. Molly Brown was one of the few who vehemently argued to return, shouting at Quartermaster Hitchens to row back and save people.
Her persistent pleas were largely ignored by the fearful, inexperienced crew and passengers around her. Only a handful of lifeboats, number 4, number 14, and the collapsible D, eventually rowed back, but by then, the screams had largely ceased. Hypothermia was the ultimate executioner. In the near-freezing water, the body's core temperature drops rapidly. The struggle lasts minutes, not hours. Wireless operator Jack Phillips, having transmitted for as long as possible, died of exposure, clinging to the overturned collapsible B. His young assistant, Harold Bride, was rescued. The brave, self-sacrificing Captain Smith was seen in the water attempting to help a child before disappearing. His body was never recovered. Colonel Astor's body was later recovered, identified by the initials sewn into his jacket and the watch he wore. The rescue, the Carpathia. At 4:10 a.m., after 3 hours of racing through the dangerous ice field at flank speed, the RMS Carpathia arrived at the coordinates. Captain Rostron's crew, operating with remarkable efficiency, began the slow, painful process of pulling the 705 freezing, shell-shocked survivors from the lifeboats. As the morning light spread across the Atlantic, it illuminated a scene of utter devastation. A vast, empty sea, littered only with floating deck chairs, splintered wood, and lifebelts, the last remnants of the greatest ship in the world. The sight was a graphic, terrifying testimony to the invisible ice. The aftermath and American accountability. The Carpathia docked in New York City on April 18, 1912, under a somber, silent rain. The news of the disaster had already gripped the American public, but the arrival of the survivors brought the tragedy into sharp, agonizing focus. A huge crowd, estimated at 40,000 people, stood in stunned silence as the Carpathia arrived, waiting for the list of the dead. The disaster instantly became a national obsession, leading to immediate high-profile inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic. The U.S. Senate inquiry, chaired by Michigan Senator William Alden Smith, was held in New York and Washington, D.C., beginning just days after the rescue. The American inquiry was notable for its aggressive, unsparing focus on accountability, particularly towards J. Bruce Ismay, the highest-ranking White Star official to survive. The testimony revealed the litany of fatal errors. Speed in ice, the reckless full-speed sailing into a known ice field. Missing binoculars, the simple, avoidable lapse that crippled the lookouts. Wireless failures, the prioritization of passenger telegrams over critical safety warnings. Lifeboat insufficiency, the shocking realization that the Titanic carried lifeboats for only 1/3 of its capacity based on outdated British regulations. The inquiry resulted in the immediate overhaul of maritime safety laws, largely driven by American outrage. 24-hour wireless watch. All ships must maintain continuous radio communication. Adequate lifeboats. The number of lifeboats must be sufficient for every person aboard. International Ice Patrol, established in 1914, to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. The sinking of the Titanic was more than a maritime disaster. It was a profound cultural shock that shattered the Edwardian faith in technology, wealth, and human superiority over nature. The 1,503 dead, a disproportionate number of them third-class immigrants, became the ultimate price paid for the hubris of the unsinkable claim. The great ship rests today 12,600 feet below the surface, a silent tomb for the lost, and a perpetual monument to the moment the Gilded Age ended, not with a whimper, but with the shattering metallic groan of a dream turning into a nightmare in the cold Atlantic night.